Hello and good morning from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, and this is your Access and Privacy Online news summary for Saturday, June 27th. This week, transparency systems under scrutiny in BC, new federal privacy and online safety proposals, whistleblower concerns from Montreal police, and major U.S. stories on public records, voter data, and law enforcement accountability. And as another reminder, House of Commons petition E7237, calling for stronger voter privacy protections, closes on July 4th. Let's dive in. We begin with a network update. FIPA continues to promote drawing access together, a new report by researcher Spencer Eisen, based on more than 3 years of research into BC's Freedom of Information systems. The report uses FOI requests to study FOI itself, examining 56 public bodies, including all ministries and a range of boards, agencies, tribunals, and crown corporations. The central finding is that most public bodies document the movement of an FOI file, who receives it, when it moves, and how it is tracked, but often do not document the critical decisions that determine whether access rights are actually fulfilled. That includes how records are searched for, retrieved, reviewed, and redacted. FIPA's message is clear. Speed matters, but timeliness alone is not enough. A healthy access system must also be judged by correctness, whether the right records are found, whether they are properly severed, and whether access is provided within the right time. The report calls for stronger record-keeping laws, greater respect for information professionals, and a more transparent way to assess transparency systems themselves. This week, the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner released a new report calling for mandatory reporting of public body FOI metrics. Commissioner Michael Harvey also recommended that public bodies establish the means to adequately track and monitor key FOI metrics, and that they begin doing so now. Commissioner Harvey identifies that BC has a transparency gap because public bodies are not required to routinely track and report FOI statistics. The OIPC identified 32 jurisdictions outside BC that require FOI metrics reporting and found that 30 of them have those requirements embedded in legislation or regulation. The OIPC also conducted informational interviews with FOI regulators in Ontario, Scotland, and Australia jurisdictions with robust FOI metrics programs based in legislation. All three confirmed the benefits of their programs outweighed implementation challenges. The Commissioner is recommending that BC amend FIPA, or the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, so public bodies must consistently track and report key metrics to the OIPC. Those metrics would include the number of requests received and closed, response times, time extensions, fees, staffing, and the volumes of records processed. This is an important step. Metrics make public systems visible and help the public understand how effectively public bodies are fulfilling their obligations under BC's Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, or FIPA. But as FIPA's research shows, metrics must be paired with deeper evidence about whether FOI responses are accurate, complete, and grounded in strong record keeping. Plus, the BC OIPC released its 2025 to 2026 annual report and service plan, warning of unprecedented demand for the office's services. The office called for reforms to modernize BC's privacy and access to information laws to better protect people's rights and earn their trust in the information age. Privacy complaints nearly doubled, rising from 456 to 904. Access complaints increased from 448 to 784. Requests for review rose from 755 to 1,110. And deemed refusal cases, where public bodies are alleged to have missed legal timelines, increased from 348 to 543. Commissioner Harvey frames the numbers as part of a wider crisis of trust. driven by outdated laws, new artificial intelligence technologies, such as large language models, and growing public concern about whether institutions are meeting their obligations. Federally, FIPA joined civil liberties and privacy organizations in warning about Bill C-22, the proposed Lawful Access Act. The coalition says the bill could make it easier for police to access personal information, could weaken encryption, and could require companies to preserve more personal data for potential law enforcement use. There would also be a bigger risk of our information being shared with U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies, including for the investigation of acts that are legal in Canada. The groups are also criticizing the federal government for cutting off committee debate, while more than 100 amendments were still before MPs, with only a fraction having been discussed before debate was cut off. Bill C-22 is too complex, and its impacts too significant to be rushed through. Don't forget that as federal privacy and surveillance issues move quickly, listeners can still sign House of Commons petition E7237 at voterprivacy.ca. That is again, voterprivacy.ca, before it closes on July 4th. Turning now to Canadian privacy stories. The Canadian Press reports that Ottawa introduced a series of digital policy proposals before Parliament rose for the summer in two important bills. Bill C-34 would require social media platforms to block access for users under age 16, unless platforms can show they have sufficient safeguards in place and don't offer adult content. Bill C-36 would recognize privacy as a fundamental right, require higher standards for children's data, and create stronger transparency requirements around automated decision-making when it comes to significant decisions about people. The same package would create a new Digital Safety and Data Protection Commission, with order-making powers and potential penalties of up to $25 million, or 5% of global revenue, for the most serious violations. These are powers the Federal Privacy Commissioner has been requesting for years. But many of the details, including how age verification will work, are still unresolved. The government says the new regulator would decide whether age assurance methods are effective and privacy protective. The government has said the bill will enable it to tackle surveillance pricing, the use of algorithms to deploy a shopper's personal data to set prices in real time. But that term isn't actually in the text. The bills will not move again until Parliament returns in the fall, and the regulator is not expected to be fully operational before 2028. Meanwhile, in Alberta, LJ reporter Emily Plial at South Peace News reports that Northern Sunrise County has updated its generative AI policy to better protect privacy. Council approved amendments to Policy 1.38 on June 9th. The county says the changes respond to new privacy legislation, NSC's Privacy Management Program, or PMP, as required under the Protection of Privacy Act, and strengthen requirements for protecting personal and confidential information when staff use AI tools. The changes will also help strengthen information requirements. The policy now addresses evolving technologies, including AI-enabled wearables, smart glasses, mobile applications, and cloud-connected assistants. The county says AI may help with administrative work, like editing correspondence, summarizing information, and preparing communications, but the policy is intended to make clear that privacy, security, and information management obligations still apply. And in Manitoba, the Canadian Press reports that the province is considering new unit pricing rules for grocery stores, following the release of a study that analyzed grocery pricing in the province. The policy is mainly about consumer protection and shrinkflation, where package sizes shrink but prices stay the same. The possible legislation would require grocers to establish standardized unit pricing so consumers can make better informed decisions. But the province is also promising action on differential pricing, the use of personal information or shopping history to charge different people different prices for the same product. Finance Minister Adrian Sala says there is little evidence the practice is currently being used in Manitoba, but the province wants to prevent it before it becomes routine. Shifting to labor and data rights, the conversation reports on a new international treaty for gig workers. Delegates at the International Labor Conference adopted Convention 193, the first binding international treaty setting labor standards for platform workers. The convention includes familiar rights such as freedom of association and access to social protections, but also addresses issues specific to the platform economy, including worker classification, unfair deactivation, and data privacy. Canada voted in favor. Meanwhile, New Zealand and the United States voted against. The analysis notes, however, that Canada's support for platform worker rights internationally sits uneasily beside domestic restrictions on the right to strike, including federal interventions in major labor disputes. It wasn't until 2017 that Canada ratified Convention 98 on the right to organize and collective bargaining, and in 2015 the Supreme Court of Canada found the right to strike is covered by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Next, Al Jazeera reporter Ghazal Azizi Kashi at the Investigative Journalism Foundation reports that experts working on residential school searches are urging the public to understand that the search for truth goes far beyond ground-penetrating radar, or GPR. The story looks at the work of the Survivors Secretariat, which has been documenting experiences connected to the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School in Ontario. Researchers say that archival records, survivor testimony, community knowledge, and privacy-respecting databases are all essential to identifying children and returning information to families and communities. Due to reinvoking trauma, GPR surveys and soil testing aren't used as often by Survivor Secretariat, and they instead favor records and documents for research. The story also highlights a difficult privacy issue. Thousands of survivor testimonies collected through the independent assessment process are scheduled for destruction in 2027, following a Supreme Court of Canada decision designed to protect confidentiality. Survivor-led researchers say those records may contain irreplaceable information while also acknowledging the need to respect privacy, consent, and Indigenous-led decision-making. Individual claimants, many of whom have passed away since giving testimonies, may request to preserve their files, but the National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation says they've received only 96 independent assessment process files so far. The Canadian Press reports that an Ontario man accused of stealing and leaking Texas Republican Party data in 2021 has pleaded guilty in Canada. Lawyers for Aubrey Cottle say he pleaded guilty in Newmar, Ontario, to unauthorized use of a computer, mischief to computer data, and a failure to comply with a release order. U.S. authorities had alleged that the suspect gained unauthorized access to the Texas Republican Party server, defaced it, downloaded a backup, and made data containing personal information available online. The department further alleged Cottle claimed responsibility for the cyber attack on social media, and a search of his electronic devices showed he was in possession of the stolen data. Cottle's lawyers say he is also charged in the United States and argue that any extradition request should be refused because he has now accepted responsibility in Canada. And finally, in Canadian privacy, the Ottawa Citizen reports that retired Canadian Forces Sergeant Tara Bertram is in a dispute with National Defence after the department allegedly shared her banking information with another military member and then mistakenly deposited that person's benefit payments into her account. The mistaken deposits totaled over $21,000. Bertram says DND later acknowledged an administrative error, but she is still being asked to repay the money with possible interest charges if there are delays. The DND said the money was supposed to go to someone with a similar last name. Bertram said that didn't make sense because the payment isn't processed by last name, but by an individual military service number. The case raises basic but serious privacy and accountability questions: how sensitive banking information was shared, why the mistake happened twice, and what support should exist when the privacy breach and the financial error both originate inside government. Turning now to access and whistleblower stories. The Canadian Press reports that Federal Information Commissioner Caroline Maynard is warning against a proposal to narrow the Access to Information Act by redefining records as official records. The Treasury Board proposal would limit access to records with ongoing business value that are stored in official repositories. The government says the change could make responses faster and more useful by excluding transitory records. Maynard strongly disagrees. She says the proposal could exclude entire categories of government-held records from public scrutiny. Maynard notes there are federal rules for identifying and destroying genuinely transitory records in a timely manner. Her position is straightforward. If a record exists when an access request is made, it should be subject to the Act. She says the appropriate solution is to ensure that institutions meet their obligations through sound information management practices. The warning is especially important in an era of Teams chats, messaging apps, temporary communications, and auto-deleting records. For Maynard, the solution is not to narrow access rights, it is to fix information management. Maynard adds that while she is relieved the government appears open to making changes to the Act, its policy approaches do not address many of the long-standing, well-documented problems with the current access to information regime. LGI reporter Shilpashri Jagannathan at New Canadian Media reports that some proof of citizenship applicants are being caught in an opaque IRCC review process. Several applicants told New Canadian Media that their files were referred to an internal unit called Program Support, but that Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC, did not explain what the unit was reviewing, why files were sent there, or when a decision could be expected. Records reviewed by NCM show that even applications marked urgent have been routed there, while the department provides no public description of the unit's mandate, referral criteria, or processing timelines. Some applicants only learned about the referral after requesting internal records through ATIP. One applicant found out through ATIP his application was sent to Program Support 5 days after it was created. The story focuses on Americans with generational ties to Canada, some of whom applied after recent changes to citizenship by descent rules. Interest among Americans in documenting Canadian citizenship appears to have risen sharply since Bill C-3 took effect in December, allowing more leniency in granting citizenship to those with generational ties to Canada. The access issue is plain when government decision-making depends on internal codes, unexplained review streams, and templated responses. People cannot understand the status of decisions that affect their families and future plans. The Canadian Press reports that experts looking at Alberta's separatism say the province should learn from Brexit before any major vote on independence. The story compares the United Kingdom's experience after leaving the European Union with Alberta's emerging debate over separation. The access to information angle comes through former Alberta finance official Lenny Kaplan, who has been seeking economic assessments from the provincial government. His FOI request for estimates prepared by his former department came up blank. In the meantime, Kaplan has been crunching his own numbers. Kaplan estimates a $39.1 billion hit to Alberta's GDP, or a 7.2% drop, over business as usual. He also predicted trade losses would rise 12%. That absence matters. A referendum debate on constitutional change requires clear public information before voters are asked to make decisions with long-term economic and democratic consequences. And LGI reporter Anushka Yadav at The Pointer reports on whistleblower allegations about conditions for deer and elk at Marineland. Animal Justice says a Marineland employee contacted its whistleblower tip line with claims that hundreds of captive deer and elk were being removed from the property, some allegedly in poor condition. According to a press release from Animal Justice, reports suggest the park may be sending some of them to slaughterhouses. The Pointer was unable to verify the claim. The story details long-standing concerns about animal welfare oversight at Marineland, including past charges, animal deaths, and repeated calls for stronger public reporting. It also highlights access barriers. Animal Justice says it has filed multiple FOI requests to learn how Ontario's animal welfare services responded to complaints, but has repeatedly been denied access or faced significant fee estimates with an initial fee estimate of $40,680. The organization appealed the decision, and the Information and Privacy Commissioner, IPC, ordered the Solicitor General to issue a final decision without collecting a fee deposit. The Solicitor General issued that decision denying disclosure under Section 65(5.2) of Ontario's Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, which states the Act does not apply to a record regarding a prosecution if all proceedings have not been completed. The Pointer also reports that its own FOI request for records related to the death of Kiska, Marineland's last captive orca, did not receive a response within legislated timelines. The broader issue is familiar. When oversight happens behind closed doors, whistleblowers become a last resort for public accountability. And in Victoria, the Canadian press reports that Muslim groups and Federal Culture Minister Mark Miller condemned an alleged attack on Imam Ibrahim Ali of BCMA Masjid al-Iman, Victoria. The BC Muslim Association says the imam was assaulted near his home after evening prayers, and that the suspect allegedly directed xenophobic remarks at him during a physical confrontation. The association says a suspect was later arrested. Police in Victoria have not yet responded to a request for information about the incident. The National Council of Canadian Muslims called the incident another reminder of the danger posed by rising Islamophobia. The BC Muslim Association said it was grateful for the swift action of Victoria Police and praised the imam's courage. Staying with whistleblower protection, a series of Canadian press stories this week focused on Montreal police. The issue began after Montreal police removed 16 officers from parole duties in Montreal Nord, including 2 who were suspected and are under criminal investigation over allegations of racist and discriminatory behavior. The investigation began in March after information was provided by fellow officers. Those allegations have triggered calls for a public inquiry and raised concerns inside the police service itself. Black employees of the Montreal Police sent a letter to management saying some staff feared reprisals for speaking out. The letter said employees had heard about efforts to identify whistleblowers in some units, leaving some people reluctant to go to work. Their message was direct, quote, "Silence does not build trust. Protecting those who speak out does," end quote. Their message comes at the same time the Quebec government is facing mounting calls to launch an independent inquiry into the police force to restore public trust. Though the force set up a hotline for whistleblowers, the letter says it's not enough to restore trust. They say the force must strengthen existing reporting mechanisms so that they are perceived as safe, independent, and credible, and that employees can use those mechanisms without fearing personal or professional consequences. Montreal police later acknowledged they are aware that some Black employees fear reprisals for denouncing racism and misconduct. The department said it does not tolerate attempts to identify or pressure people who report wrongdoing, but its statement did not provide details about new steps taken in response to those concerns. Montreal Mayor Soraya Martinez-Farada is facing mounting pressures to call a public inquiry into systemic racism in Montreal. Black public servants working for the city of Montreal have also drafted their own letter calling for major reforms to crack down on systemic racism. Montreal Mayor Soraya Martinez-Farada's office has confirmed it received both letters. The Quebec Premier Christine Frechette has said she is open to launching a public inquiry after the current investigation is complete. Quebec has appointed lawyer Anne-Marie Boivier as an independent observer to oversee the criminal and disciplinary investigations. Meanwhile, Montreal's police chief is expected to meet city officials responsible for public safety behind closed doors, rather than review the department's annual report in a public meeting. That choice has its own accountability implications. At the heart of the story is a basic governance question. When allegations involve racism inside a public institution, how do employees and the public know that reporting systems are safe, independent, and credible? Now to international stories. The Associated Press reports that the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration permitted hundreds of thousands of fentanyl pills to reach the streets of New Mexico between 2023 and 2025, while agents monitored shipments as part of broader investigations. The reporting is based on government records and interviews with current and former DEA agents, including whistleblower David Howell. Howell told AP that agents watched shipments and did not seize them, in some cases despite detailed surveillance and pill counts. He filed a whistleblower complaint in 2023, arguing that the tactic risked public safety, potentially imperiled communities in and around Albuquerque, and may have violated Justice Department guidance. The DEA says the investigative decisions were lawful, reasonable, and consistent with department guidance. Former U.S. Attorney Alex Ubalez says authorities sometimes allowed shipments to continue in order to build larger cases against major trafficking organizations. The DEA has long stated it would not be plausible to seize every shipment of every drug. However, the strategy of allowing staggering amounts of counterfeit painkillers to hit the streets shocked several veteran agents. The story raised a stark accountability question. When law enforcement makes high-risk decisions in secret, how can the public evaluate whether those decisions protected communities or endangered them? AP also published a companion piece explaining how the reporting came together. Reporter Jim Mustian and colleague Joshua Goodman reviewed internal DEA records and interviewed current and former agents. The whistleblower complaint accusing the DEA of allowing fentanyl to hit the streets of New Mexico was heavily redacted to shield not only the whistleblower's identity, but the amount of fentanyl that was not seized. However, a critical oversight left the letter I unredacted in the document. Mustian sent out messages on LinkedIn to DEA agents whose name ended in I and had worked in Albuquerque, leading to Howell messaging back. Mustian said the story shows the gap between what the government does with public resources and what the public is allowed to know. He also noted that many of the records uncovered would not have been released under the Freedom of Information Act. That makes the whistleblower's role central. Without internal disclosures, the public may never see how these operational decisions were being made. The Associated Press, through Mirror Indy, also reports on what it calls Indianapolis's hospital-to-jail pipeline. The investigation examines arrests by police at Eskenazi Health, the city's public hospital. Records from the past 5 years show the hospital's police force made more than 800 arrests, with many involving nonviolent offenses such as trespass, disorderly conduct, and resisting law enforcement. The story focuses in part on Adela Patton, a woman diagnosed with schizophrenia who reportedly went to the hospital while homeless and in crisis, but was arrested for trespassing. Experts say these types of incidents, especially in healthcare settings, often indicate mental health issues. Eskenazi says arrest is a last resort and that officers receive training in de-escalation and mental health response. Eskenazi's leaders said they did not track what happens to people after they've been arrested by hospital police, including whether a person was charged by the prosecutor's office, convicted of a crime, or simply released. But the Marion County Sheriff ended a special duty arrangement with the hospital, saying law enforcement should think carefully before using handcuffs in healthcare settings. The access issue is significant. Eskenazi redacted names from arrest records, citing patient privacy law. They also declined to provide a roster of officers. Press freedom advocates argue arrest records are public records, not medical records, and that hospitals should not be able to use privacy law to shield policing activity from scrutiny. In Washington, the Associated Press reports that a federal judge has blocked use of a revamped citizenship checking database central to the Trump administration's election efforts. The program, called Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements, known as SAVE, had been expanded so election officials could run large batches of voter registration data through federal systems. Advocacy groups argued the changes aggregated sensitive personal information in ways that could wrongly purge eligible voters. U.S. District Court Judge Sparkle Suknanen ruled that the federal government had violated privacy protections and threatened voting rights. She said Congress had expressly prohibited the government from centralizing Americans' personal identifying information, and that the federal agencies that created the SAVE program knew that the database violates those statutory protections. At least 67 million registrations had reportedly been scanned through the system since 2025. The ruling highlights the risk of repurposing government databases. Data collected for one administrative purpose can have serious consequences when used for another, especially when errors affect the right to vote. And finally, the Associated Press, through the Oakland side, reports that a California bill could significantly weaken public records access. Assembly Bill 1821 began as a modest timeline change, but amendments would allow governments to treat some requests as commercial, charge hourly fees for searching and reviewing records that could cost anywhere from $22 to $66 per hour, and sue requesters they believe are acting with malicious intent. This could add up to hundreds or even thousands of dollars for complex requests. Currently, government agencies can only charge fees for the cost of copying records, a charge usually waived when records are provided digitally. The bill would give agencies broad powers to restrict when and how people file public records requests, for example, by only accepting them by phone or email during regular business hours. Oakland and many other local governments currently accept requests 24/7 through an online portal. Supporters say local governments are overwhelmed by broad and burdensome requests, including requests that may be connected to artificial intelligence or commercial data extraction. But press freedom and transparency groups warn that the bill could chill access rights and create financial barriers for journalists, community groups, and ordinary residents. As one critic put it, the bill would move California in the wrong direction at a time when democratic accountability is under pressure. That's it for this week's Access and Privacy Online News Summary. As always, we hope today's stories help you stay informed about the latest issues in privacy, information management, access to information, and public accountability. If you value this work, please subscribe to FIPA News Monitoring, share the podcast, or consider supporting FIPA directly. And one last reminder, House of Commons petition E7237, calling for stronger voter privacy protections, closes on July 4th. If this issue matters to you, please take a moment to sign and share it before the deadline. Our writer is Sean Fisk. Original music for today's show was composed by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, your host and producer. Thank you to the reporters, contributors, and outlets whose work make this podcast possible. And to you, our listeners, for staying engaged. Stay safe and stay informed.